I wish we could be together in person. We can't, but this is at least something. I also need to just give my own apologies from the beginning. I have to go to London before too long, so I'll be around for not the whole of the session, I'm afraid. I might hopefully get to London in time to catch the panel discussion, and I'll try to keep up with Zoom on my phone on the journey, but I apologize for not being as present as I would like throughout. Okay, so the strength of weak artificial consciousness. This title is inspired by a whole raft of similar titles. There was Mark Granovetter's famous paper in Social Network Theory, The Strength of Weak Ties. People talk about the difference between weak AI and strong AI. Of course, the intuition here is that weak artificial something is just a simulation of that thing, and strong artificial something is instantiation of that thing. And I've realized I've spelled artificial wrong on this slide, which is highly regrettable. So I'm going to argue for the strength of weak artificial consciousness. Another way to think of this, why is this not working now? Oh no. Sorry, more technical difficulties. My presentation has, let's go. Let's now come back again. All right, good. Is what to do about Ava in Ex Machina. For those of you who've seen this fantastic film, it's all about many of the ethical and social issues that arise with technologies that at least give the appearance of being conscious or equivalently sentient. So it's a wonderful film. It's getting on for 6 years old now, but it's just a brilliant film. Okay, so on the menu for today is I'm really sorry, but for some reason, the slides are not advancing. Okay, this is really bad. I'm gonna have to stop this and start it again. Share screen, portion of screen, share. Keynote, play, rehearse. Okay, are we going to have fun this time? We are. So far, so good. On the menu for today, then, the difference, as I see it anyway, between consciousness and intelligence, and why. Here I want to ask, like, why is it often assumed that artificial intelligence is the royal road to artificial consciousness? Then I'll talk about various different theories of consciousness, just skating over them because I don't have much time, and ask which of them, if any, implies the possibility of artificial consciousness and what it would take. This is no good, sorry. What is? Now this is all on my side. I must admit it's just not working. Share again, or I'm just going to share the whole screen this time.
The day when the AI decided to take over.
Yeah, it's clearly upset about what I'm going to be saying. So, right, is that? Can you see that? Yes. Okay, let's see how far it goes this time. Not very far. This has never occurred before. Okay, that's, I'm a bit cautious what's going to happen. I'll talk then about some particular views of my own about how consciousness happens and what the implications of that might be for artificial consciousness. And then I'll finish with some thoughts about good directions for people pursuing the area of artificial consciousness. So first, consciousness and intelligence. So intelligence very broadly is the ability to do the right thing at the right time. I think that's possibly the most general definition of what intelligence is all about. Many examples of intelligence in both the artificial world and the natural world are quite specific. We have AlphaGo and other variants of that are very good at specific things, but very bad at things they're not designed or trained to do. Even in nature, many animals show incredible narrow intelligence in their specific ecological niches, in their specific domains. but they don't show this general, flexible ability to do the right thing at the right time in a vast range of novel environments, such as we humans are, at least sometimes, under some circumstances, able to do. So human intelligence is highly general. Consciousness, on the other hand, is just a very different thing. Going back to Tom Nagel, perhaps the most general definition of consciousness is that for a conscious creature, there is something it is like to be that creature. There's something it's like to be me, something it's like to be you, something it's like to be a dog or a cat, but probably nothing it's like to be an iPhone or any current AI system, although some might already disagree with that. For those systems, there's no inner universe, there's nothing going on. Consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. Well, we can dig a little further into definitions of consciousness. A common distinction is made between, I think relevant to discussions of artificial consciousness, between phenomenal consciousness, which we can think of raw experience, the redness of red, the sharpness of pain. Some people would argue that this is a mistake to think that such a thing exists. I think such a thing exists. And then there's access consciousness, which is roughly what we can do, what consciousness enables us to do, what its functional roles might be. Things like when we're conscious of something, it allows us to behave in particular ways, very flexibly often, with respect to that thing. Access consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, this distinction traces back to Ned Block. In my thinking about consciousness, I tend to break it up in a slightly different way, thinking about what the general properties of conscious experience are and how one might account for these properties in terms of mechanisms, things happening inside brains and bodies. And this is sort of what I've called the real problem approach, rather than the hard problem of treating it as one big scary mystery. Just distinguish, for instance, between conscious level, how conscious you are, conscious content, what you're conscious of, and conscious self, the experience of being an individual, of being a self. And by explaining, predicting, controlling these different aspects of consciousness, I think it's possible to make progress on understanding the biological basis of consciousness, even without directly addressing the problem of how or if it makes sense to understand how you magic experience from mechanism. So back to Ava and this idea of why should we think that building increasingly intelligent and human-like systems might lead to consciousness? Now, perhaps we don't all think this. It will be interesting to discuss after during this panel this afternoon. Why is it tempting to think that this might be the case? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. The first reason is we kind of like the idea, or science fiction likes us to like the idea. There's very many examples. Ex Machina is one, but going back to 2001, Blade Runner, all sorts of things that encourage us to think of a very close association between intelligence and consciousness. Uh-oh, it stopped again. Okay, now it started again. Then there is the idea of the singularity. So this idea that we're on an exponential curve of technological development, and we might be approaching some inflection point, although of course on an exponential curve, every point is an inflection point. But we might be approaching some stage on this curve in which we bootstrap our technologies beyond human understanding and control, which could be very problematic, but may also be the point at which AI develops general human level AI, and often assumed, well, maybe that's the point at which the lights come on, at which artificial intelligence transmogrifies into artificial consciousness. Now, there's a fundamental assumption that sort of commonly assumed that underlies and also drives this equivalence, and that's the perspective of functionalism in philosophy of mind. And there are two aspects to functionalism. First is, or at least two aspects. One is a sort of idea of substrate independence, that it doesn't really matter that the brain is made of neurons and the computers are made of carbon and silicon, or silicon rather. If the mechanisms are the same in some important way, or the input-output functions are the same, then consciousness will happen. That's in fact the second aspect of functionalism, that the idea of substrate independence. It doesn't really idea, it's a bit of a stronger assumption that all that really counts are how inputs are transformed into outputs, not the mechanism, not the specifics of the internal mechanism. The functionalism is quite widely assumed especially in consciousness research, but I don't think there's and we can argue about this, but I don't really think there's a very compelling reason either to assume it or to reject it. It just seems an open question about whether functionalism is the case or not. And the final reason why we are encouraged to think of this association between AI and artificial consciousness is a mixture of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. I think we, as humans, we tend to think that we're at the center of everything, the top of every pyramid, and we are intelligent, or at least we declare ourselves to be distinctively intelligent, and we are conscious. So there's the temptation again to put these things together. But of course, we are not at the top of every pyramid, at the center of the rest of the universe. We're just one twig on a beautifully delicate evolutionary tree. So there's no reason to think that just because we are intelligent and conscious, that these concepts are coextensive to or overlapping to a degree that would make artificial consciousness go along with artificial intelligence. In fact, I would argue there's a near double dissociation between consciousness and intelligence. Intelligence is not necessary for consciousness, or at least not much intelligence is necessary for consciousness, and intelligence is not sufficient for consciousness either. We might have a situation a little bit like this, where there's both consciousness and intelligence are not single dimensions. So they're like the cones are there just to illustrate there are multiple dimensions that we might think of both consciousness and intelligence. But they do point in roughly different directions. There are empirical correlations. Humans might be, in some reasonable sense, both more intelligent and more conscious than mice or ants. But one can imagine highly intelligent technologies that need not be conscious, and perhaps the other way around too. Okay, so artificial intelligence need not lead to artificial consciousness, and we might not even think that it should if we reflect on the reasons why that equivalence or that trajectory seems appealing. So let's instead ask, what do current theories of consciousness say about the possibility of artificial consciousness? If not artificial intelligence, then what? Well, this is a very quick skate over 4 current theoretical perspectives on consciousness. The first is global workspace theory, which says very roughly, consciousness happens when information is broadcast in a global workspace. The brain that's usually centered on the frontal and parietal regions. You have unconscious information processing or signal detection or signal propagation in modality-specific regions of the brain. And at some threshold, you get ignition, and the information carried in that local activity is propagated into the global workspace. And it's the process of broadcast itself that instantiates consciousness. This matches a lot of empirical data, and it accounts very well for some of the functional properties of consciousness, that when we are conscious of, let's say, a sensory stimulus, we can behave very flexibly with respect to it. We can remember it. We can talk about it because it's broadcast in this global workspace. So that's one theory of consciousness. It's much more to do with access consciousness than phenomenal consciousness. Another theory, a very interesting and popular theory, is the higher order thought theory, or more generally, higher order theories of consciousness, which say, generally, consciousness happens when a higher order process re-represents lower order mental states in a particular way. And higher order theories differ according to the particular way they think is important. So here, consciousness happens when you have a hierarchical relationship between mental states that take a particular form. And this form is of not just hierarchically deeper, but a form of re-representation. And it's typically thought of as areas in the frontal parts of the brain looking at other mental states in other parts of the brain in a particular way that says, you are now a conscious mental state. This again fits nicely with some empirical data that emphasizes frontal involvement in consciousness. And it has a pretty rigorous and well worked out and appealing philosophical background that goes back to David Rosenthal. Is this enough? Well, if you buy into these theories, basically, yes, it is. You can build artificial systems made of whatever that will be conscious on these theories. There was a paper and affiliation who argue that indeed, if you build machines that have this broadcast and higher order monitoring, they will be conscious. They equivocate a bit about whether they actually mean phenomenal conscious as well. In fact, they just say, we're not really talking about that. We're talking about access consciousness. But on these theories, if you buy into them, then it's possible to build machines that instantiate access consciousness. Okay. Integrated information theory, one of all of our favorite theories to argue about. In fact, I remember first meeting Yosha in the context of an extended argument about integrated information theory, which was a lot of fun. It is due to Giulio Tononi, of course, and it's a very provocative and unique theory of consciousness, which I don't have time to explain in detail, just to say that on IIT, consciousness is identified with local maxima of irreducible integrated information generated by a system. Now, it's a bit long to unpack, but what it basically says, what's important here, is that it starts from axioms or general properties of phenomenology that every conscious experience is informative because it rules out a large number of alternatives. Every conscious experience is integrated. It appears to us unified as a whole. So therefore, the mechanisms that are identified with consciousness should have the same properties. Now, it's a very, very strong theory of consciousness in that it's saying that any mechanism that satisfies the necessary constraints, or as he calls them, postulates, will exhibit consciousness. It proposes sufficient conditions for consciousness. And it post-dictively explains some pretty well-known observations about consciousness. For instance, that the cortex is majorly involved in consciousness. Forget about the front versus back debate here, but in general, the sort of anatomy that you find in the cortex is well suited to generating high levels of integrated information. By contrast, the sort of circuitry that you find in the cerebellum is not suited to generating high levels of integrated information, even though the cerebellum has 3/4 of all the neurons in the brain. So it's post-dictively rather nice, but it makes some very strong predictions about what kinds of things might exhibit consciousness. For instance, a very simple neural network, such as on the left, which just maps an input to an output, but has lots of recurrent connections, will be conscious to a degree of 0.76 if you buy into the theory. Now, notice this network isn't doing anything remotely intelligent. It's just exhibiting a irreducible local maxima of integrated information. But if you implement the same mapping, input to output, in a strictly feed-forward network, that feed-forward network will not integrate any information. It is 050 consciousness. This is a fascinating distinction because it basically retains one aspect of functionalism, which is that the substrate doesn't matter. You can build these things out of anything, but it's more than just getting the input-output mapping right. The structure, internal structure, has to exhibit the right kind of causal cause-effect structure, cause-effect mechanism. Can't just have a feed-forward network. So it's sort of one part of functionalism, but not the other. Okay, so is that enough? Well, yes, sometimes if you build your things that have the right cause-effect structure, then you can build artificially conscious systems that need not be intelligent. Okay, now, moving swiftly on to the fourth idea about consciousness, which is where I place my sort of chips, if you like, which is this idea of controlled hallucinations and beast machines, or predictive processing more generally. Now, the basic idea of this is that everything that we perceive is an inference about the causes of sensory signals. So the brain is a kind of prediction machine that's locked inside the bony vault of the skull. It doesn't know what's out there. All it gets are unlabeled, noisy, ambiguous sensory signals. So perceptual content is determined by a process of inference, of Bayesian best guessing about the noisy, ambiguous, unlabeled, colorless, soundless, shapeless sensory signals themselves. How is this accomplished in the brain? Well, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of really productive and interesting work about this. The broad idea is that there is a process of predictive processing going on in many parts of the brain, especially in perceptual cortices, wherein top-down predictions about the causes of sensory signals are continuously calibrated and updated by the sensory signals, which act as prediction errors in the brain. And by continuously minimizing prediction errors everywhere and all the time, the whole system will settle into an approximation of optimal Bayesian inference, a best guess about the causes of sensory signals. And the idea is the joint content, all the inside-out, top-down predictions that determines perceptual content. Now, importantly, predictive processing is not a theory of consciousness. At least it need not be, and it's not in the way I think of it, at least not at first. It's a more general theory of perception and action and so on. But it can be used to begin to account for different properties of phenomenology, of conscious experience, in terms of underlying mechanism, in terms of different kinds of top-down predictions. And that's what I talk about a lot in the new book and all these things. I don't have time to do it here, but it's sort of this real problem style where instead of trying to say, what is sufficient for consciousness full stop, how can we begin to explain, predict, and control the diverse properties of consciousness? So I wrote about this with Jakob Hochwe a year or two ago. Now, for instance, many of you might have seen this before, you can use predictive processing to simulate the phenomenology of hallucinations of different sorts. This is quite an old thing now where we simulated some weird psychedelic-like, but not really, experience on Sussex campus. So you can simulate exteroceptive visual perceptual phenomenology. Now, critically though, if you follow this thread of ideas all the way through, there are also perceptual inferences about the experience of having a body and about the body from within. This is now the domain of conscious self. We experience being a body too. This brings up the terrain of interoception, all the different ways in which the brain perceives and regulates the interior of the physical, biological, physiological flesh and blood body. And again, the brain has no direct access to the state of the body. It has to infer the state of the body based on sensory data. And so there's, again, the idea is, at least, it's harder to empirically test, a process of prediction and prediction error. But now this dance of prediction and prediction error, of prediction error minimization, is happening largely, but not entirely, within the body itself. So I've called this before the process of interoceptive inference, along with other people like Lisa Feldman Barrett and so on. Critically, interoceptive predictions are different, not only in the sorts of sensory signals that are involved, but in their function too. So while to a first approximation, things like visual predictions are about finding out what's out there, where it's going, what it is, interoceptive predictions are about controlling, regulating, keeping the essential physiological variables like blood pressure and heart rate within the ranges compatible for survival. They're about controlling things rather than finding things out. And this may be why the perceptual content of an emotion, which is I think of as a control-oriented perception of the interior of the body, has a very different character to a perceptual experience of something outside. This in turn brings up this idea of active inference. So we can we can minimize prediction errors both by updating predictions or by changing the data, by making actions. And when we suppress prediction errors by making actions, that's active inference. And we can think of interoceptive inference as leveraging prediction for control through active inference, through changing the data. And having a predictive model is a very good way of doing control. This goes right back to cybernetics. Every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. You can, this is now a sort of, back in the 1950s when cybernetics and AI were all in the same mix, these ideas were all being discussed together, and then cybernetics, of course, split off, and good old-fashioned AI took on to gain momentum. But there is this rich tradition of thinking about machines from the perspective of regulation and control, and that motivates the idea of predictive processing from a very basic starting point of regulation. It relates to Carl Friston's free energy principle, which is probably the most ambitious articulation of these ideas. that organisms maintain themselves in the states they expect to be in the long run. And they do this, at least when things get complex, in virtue of having predictive models about the disturbances or the causal structure of their interiors. So this is a very quick whistle stop tour, but if you think along these lines, you get to the point where consciousness, instead of being because all the predictive models that undergird all our perceptual experiences, whether they're of the self of the world or of the world, have their origin evolutionarily, developmentally, and in day-to-day operation, deeply tied up with the imperative to regulate the body's physiological state, to keep us alive. We perceive, on this view, we perceive the world and ourselves with, through, and because of our living bodies. And of course, there's no sharp distinction in the body between mindware and wetware. There's this sort of imperative for preservation, for regulation, for sustaining, operates at many, many different levels of description. And we can trace, or we can rather put this into contrast with poor old Descartes, who always comes in for some criticism in discussions of consciousness. One of the things he said was that he tried to say that without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. That being made of flesh and blood is, in Descartes' view here, pretty much irrelevant to the kind of consciousness that matters, human rational consciousness. I think it might be rather the other way around, that conscious selfhood arises because of and not in spite of our beast machine nature. Is this enough if we think this way? Well, maybe. There are two sorts of things going on here. The weaker claim is that understanding consciousness requires understanding its grounding, its origin, its expression in the regulation of life systems in living animals. The stronger claim is that maybe conscious machines need to be living machines. Maybe life is a necessary condition. It won't be a sufficient condition. It might be a necessary condition for consciousness. And to be intellectually honest, to just be honest about this, I don't know which of these is correct. I have a tendency towards the latter, just because, again, there's no sharp distinction between mindware and wetware in biological systems. There's no obvious place where you can say, okay, the substrate doesn't matter anymore. But it's something that is still evolving. Okay, so the last part of the talk, and then I'll stop. What should we not do given these different perspectives on artificial consciousness? Well, we can go back to think about the Turing test here. This is this sort of benchmark test we're all very familiar with about intelligence. Of course, it's not a test of consciousness. The idea of the Turing test is it's passed when a human can no longer distinguish between another human and a machine. Of course, it's in this weird context of disembodied typewritten interactions and so on. It's quite possible. I mean, there's already been fairly trite claims of the Turing test being passed by this or that chatbot, but it's certainly quite feasible that at least the original version of Turing's test will be passed in a convincing way. That does not, at least in my view, imply consciousness. What we have instead is what's been called by Murray Shanahan the Garland test, Ex Machina again. There's a beautiful piece of dialogue in Ex Machina where I've forgotten the name now, Caleb is talking to the Oscar Isaac character, whose name Nathan, and says something that the real test is to show you that she's a machine and see if you still feel that she's conscious. So it's a test about consciousness, and it's explicitly here a test of the human rather than the machine. It's sort of still left agnostic of what this means for the conscious status of the machine. Now, as we develop these technologies, it seems possible that systems may even pass the Garland test. At least there are combinations of things like deepfake videos with GPT-style language generation networks that might well give the impression of being aware. And this raises a number of really important issues. One, which I think Thomas Metzinger has said a lot about, is the artificial suffering problem. If we do, in fact, introduce artificial consciousness in the world, we, of course, raise the possibility of introducing artificial suffering, and that would be an ethical catastrophe. It's even more worrying because we might not know. If we build systems That, for instance, if IIT happens to be right and we build systems that are conscious but don't really behave in any way that suggests that they are, then we have a real problem on our hands. The other issue is even if we build systems that only give the appearance of being conscious, what will that do to our psyches? This again has been explored in things like Westworld, where inhabiting and behaving in various ways with things that give the appearance of being conscious, maybe they are, really damages our own human psyches as well. This beautiful new novel by Katsuo Ishiguro explores this in a much more restrained way than Westworld, and is a fantastic read too. So there's good reasons already to not build things that we think of or think have the possibility of being actually conscious. And indeed, I think we should be worried perhaps more than worrying about near future AI about things like conscious organoids, which are brain-like structures grown in a dish. Now, these remain very simple at the moment, but they're getting very complicated quite quickly, and they're grown at scale, and they're made out of neurons. So the whole issue of substrate independence doesn't really matter so much when it comes to organoids. In fact, we've written about this a bit with Tim Bain and Marcello Massimini in a paper called Are There Islands of Awareness for Trends last year. So to finish, I'm arguing here then for the strength of weak artificial consciousness, not to try to build actually artificial conscious systems, not to engage in strong AC, but to simulate properties of consciousness in artificial systems. This has a number of benefits. AI can help consciousness science by computational models that can bridge the gap between mechanism and phenomenology. And consciousness science can help AI by endowing AI systems with some of the functions associated with consciousness that current AI is not very good at yet. So one example from the former, and this is something we're doing in the lab now, we're basically taking deep generative coupled networks of generative and discriminator networks, GAN-like systems, to simulate different kinds of perceptual hallucination and get a much more finessed computational understanding of the space of abnormal perceptual phenomenology. And the other way around, there are many things where a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of human consciousness could help build better AI, outer distribution generalization, active data sampling, error monitoring, metacognition, confidence judgments that can be, AI system could judge how well it's doing at different tasks, perceptual integration, and so on. Lots of things we can do usefully for AI without aiming at this goal of building a system that actually has experience. So, summary. Consciousness is not the same as intelligence. Artificial consciousness will not come along for the ride with AI as it develops. Different theories of consciousness predict different things, different necessary and or sufficient conditions for artificial consciousness. The substrate might matter. This is something I think can't dismiss the possibility of, and certainly this connection between consciousness and life suggests that it really might matter. And artificial consciousness in its strong form is something to avoid, not desire. So there are many exciting opportunities to not build conscious machines. And I'll leave it there because we started late. Thank you for your attention. And I can't resist, I have to just give a little plug for the book, which came out just 10 days ago. In the UK, you'll have to wait until October the 12th in the US before it's available there. But it's going well in the UK, and I hope some of you get to read it. Thank you very much. I will stop.
Thank you very much, Anil. Let's see.
Oh, you sent me a message saying time is up. Sorry, I didn't see the message.
Yes.
Joshua, since Anil might not be able to come back, maybe we could take a couple of questions. I wouldn't be obsessed with the timing.
Do we have time in the end? So is this link going to end sharply? Is there another session?
No, the
afterwards?
link is not going to end. There is another session, but those are people probably mostly in the room. I don't think anybody would mind, waiting a little bit.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions then. Do we have any takers at the moment? Let's see. Do we have anybody in the audience who wants to speak?
Oh, somebody, I see a hand. Ah, it's Matthew.
Yes.
Hey, very nice. Oh, sorry. Should I go on?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
That was great. I just want to ask a simple question. It sounds like you presume that if you hallucinate, then you're conscious.
Yes. Yeah, I think hallucination is an altered form of perceptual experience, but yes. Certainly doesn't have to be accurate to count as being conscious.
Manuel? We don't see your microphone. It's not even muted. There is no microphone. Oh. I think that your audio might not be configured. You can type your questions and we read it for everyone.
My question is about the immorality of building machines that suffer. What about the fact, isn't it equally immoral then to have children?
Well, that's, I mean, that, to be honest, that's a little out of my wheelhouse. There are many reasons why having kids can be thought of as not really fair on the world or on the kids because of the way kids are going. I think Thomas has also said, if you integrate under the curve of human experience generally, you're probably more negative than positive. So there is something about that. But yeah, that to me is part of what being human is. Whereas trying to build a machine that is conscious is really optional. We just don't have to do that. And so it's a much more pragmatic question to ask rather than trying to draw any moral absolutes about or absolute moral comparisons between the two cases.
But I'm going to add my 2 cents that you would like to have these machines have empathy. If they don't feel certain things, they're not going to have the empathy. So there is another whole other side of the coin here as well.
But again, you could build you could have as a goal building a machine that is effective at simulating empathy. But even if you do that, then you still face some of these other problems about what will that do to how we treat the rest of our social environment. One thing that might happen, another possible scenario, is that we end up caring more about systems that we know are not conscious but simulate empathy compared to other animals or other humans that we know are conscious but for whom we don't feel empathy because they're on the other side of the world or don't look like us. And that's a highly ethical, problematic scenario to end up in.
Okay, this is for another whole session, so I want to hear the rest. We're on the way to the airport. You may have to tune out soon, but I want to hear as much as
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to hear as much as we can.
Thank you, Lenore.
Cameron has also asked a question about whether consciousness and suffering are separate and necessarily intertwined. But we will revisit this, I think, in the talk by Thomas Metzinger to some degree. And I would suggest that we keep the questions very short because we want to have a little bit of discussion in the end, if possible.
Okay. Do you want me to stop or do you want me to add?
Let's stop and revisit it later in the panel, if possible, if we have time left.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the keynote